The Amending Act of 1781 Bridging Gaps in Colonial Governance. In this video, we will be discussing the following aspects of the topic. The Amending Act of 1781, often referred to as the Act of Settlement, marked a crucial intervention by the British Parliament to rectify the flaws within the Regulating Act of 1773. As the East India Company's governance continued to evolve, administrative challenges and growing tensions between the company's operations and the legal framework in India required rectification. The Amending Act aimed to balance the authority of the East India Company's executives, the judicial system, and the growing need for coherence in governance. By understanding its key provisions and their implications, one can trace the trajectory of British colonial rule and its long-lasting impacts on India. The background to the Amending Act. The Regulating Act of 1773 had been the first attempt by the British government to control the administration of the East India Company, primarily through the establishment of the Office of Governor-General and the introduction of the Supreme Court in Calcutta. However, the Regulating Act was fraught with shortcomings, particularly in its handling of the judicial oversight and the tensions between the company's administrative powers and the judiciary. It quickly became clear that there were several gaps, especially regarding the relationship between the Governor-General, the Council, and the Supreme Court. In response to these issues, the British Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781 seeking to address these shortcomings and smoothen the governance process. The Act's provisions provided clarity on the scope of authority for the company officials and laid the groundwork for further consolidation of British rule in India. Now, moving on to the key provisions of the Amending Act of 1781, we will learn about 5 key provisions under this Act. 1. Exemption from Supreme Court jurisdiction. One of the critical features of the Amending Act was the exemption it granted to the Governor-General, the Council, and company officials from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for actions performed in their official capacity. Under the Regulating Act, there had been a conflict between the British officials and the Supreme Court, particularly when the court intervened in the company's internal affairs. The Amending Act resolved this issue by declaring that actions undertaken in the course of official duties would not be subject to judicial review by the Supreme Court. This provision ensured that the East India Company's leadership, including the Governor-General and Council members, could operate without interference from the judicial system, thereby consolidating the power of the company. 2. Exclusion of revenue matters from Supreme Court jurisdiction. The Amending Act also clarified that revenue matters and actions related to the collection of revenue were outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. This was significant because revenue collection was the primary means through which the British extracted wealth from India. The company's officers were not bound by judicial scrutiny for their role in revenue matters, allowing them to carry out their operations without legal constraints. Given the immense economic stakes tied to revenue collection, this provision allowed the company to further entrench its dominance in India's economy. 3. Jurisdiction over inhabitants of Calcutta. Another crucial aspect of the Amending Act was the jurisdiction it granted to the Supreme Court over all inhabitants of Calcutta. This provision required the Supreme Court to administer justice in accordance with the personal laws of the defendants. Hindus were to be tried under Hindu law and Muslims under Mohammedan law. While the intent was to respect the local customs and practices, this created a dual legal system, often leading to confusion and inconsistencies. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over all inhabitants of Calcutta was an attempt to assert British authority over the growing metropolis, ensuring that the judiciary played a role in governing the urban centres, which were rapidly becoming the backbone of British rule in India. 4. Appeals from provincial courts to the Governor-General in Council. Under the Amending Act, appeals from the provincial courts could no longer be made to the Supreme Court but were directed to the Governor-General in Council. This shift signified a centralization of legal authority in the hands of the Governor-General and his Council. This move reinforced the political dominance of the British administration as it ensured that judicial decisions made in the provinces were subject to the authority of the central government rather than an independent judiciary. By restricting the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, the Amending Act reinforced the supremacy of the executive over judicial matters. 5. Governor-General in Council's power to regulate provincial courts. The Amending Act also granted the Governor-General in Council the power to frame regulations for the provincial courts and councils. This provision further centralized administrative control, as it allowed the central authority to determine the functioning of the lower courts. This move further marginalized local governance structures and made the judicial system more aligned with the central colonial objectives. The ability to regulate provincial courts gave the British an additional mechanism to exert control over the legal processes in India, reinforcing their colonial dominance. The broader context, colonial consolidation and legal framework. The Amending Act of 1781 was part of a broader effort by the British to consolidate their colonial rule over India. By clarifying the roles and powers of company officials and the judiciary, the British aimed to create a more efficient administrative structure. However, it also exemplified the growing centralization of power, where executive control often superseded judicial autonomy. The Act effectively set the stage for the company to function without significant checks on its authority, solidifying its control over both governance and the economy in India. In a broader context, the legal and political restructuring initiated by the Amending Act also laid the groundwork for the system of governance that would persist throughout the British Raj. The separation of powers, which is a cornerstone of modern democratic systems, was absent in the colonial administration. The Amending Act of 1781 further entrenched a system where executive, legislative, and judicial powers were concentrated in the hands of the British officials, leaving little room for indigenous voices or legal autonomy. Recent happenings and the relevance of historical acts. The principles of centralization and consolidation of power that were present in the Amending Act of 1781 are still relevant in contemporary governance debates. For example, recent discussions around judicial independence and executive overreach in India often draw comparisons to the colonial legal framework. The increasing power of the executive in shaping judicial appointments and decisions in modern India highlights the tensions that have existed since colonial times between the judiciary and the government. Furthermore, the continued challenges in India's revenue collection systems, bureaucratic inefficiency, and judicial delays can be traced back to the legacy of colonial legal and administrative structures. The lack of judicial scrutiny over executive actions, as seen in the Amending Act, can still be observed in certain aspects of governance today, especially when it comes to the balance of power between institutions. In conclusion, the Amending Act of 1781 was a significant step in the evolution of British colonial governance in India. By addressing the flaws of the Regulating Act of 1773, it aimed to streamline the functioning of the East India Company's administration, reduce judicial interference, and centralize power under the Governor-General and his council. While it reinforced British control over India, it also laid the foundation for the legal and political structures that would define the colonial system for the next century. Understanding the Amending Act's provisions and their long-term implications helps us better comprehend the complexities of colonial governance and its enduring impact on modern India.